Hello everybody, this is Mr. US History, and welcome to a brand new video. Today I will be tier ranking every US president, all the way from Washington to George W. Bush. I've been wanting to make this video for a very long time, and I'm very happy that I have the chance to do so right now. Now, I will not be ranking Presidents Obama, Trump, Harrison, Garfield, and Taylor because of the fact that I believe that their term as president was way too short, as well as the fact that Obama and Trump are too recent for me to fairly rank them. So now let's get started with George Washington, the father of the country, easy S tier. He was a fantastic president. He really set all the norms and standards for how a president should use their power. He also was the first president, so he really set the groundwork for the country, not to mention the fact that he had stepped down after 2 terms, which was a precedent that every president who succeeded him had followed. He also knew how to walk the fine line between being tyrannical and being a strong leader, especially with regard to the Whiskey Rebellion. Also, he knew the importance of staying out of foreign affairs, especially near the early history of our country, where had we gotten involved in that war between France and Britain, we would have certainly been destroyed. Washington understood this and kept us neutral. Also, he stressed that political parties were a fundamental danger to our country, and all they did was that they divided people. And really, his farewell address was fantastic, and I think he is easily an S tier president. So Thomas Jefferson, well, I think I have this slightly out of order. Yeah, John Adams. So John Adams, I'd say, is C tier. The reason why I'd say John Adams is not as good as Washington is, first up, I think John Adams is another one of those presidents where you have them have a really good public service and career before they were president, but when they were president, they didn't really do all that much. And here's the thing with John Adams. He did keep us out of a war with France successfully, and he was able to avoid a violent war with France, and he eased tensions in a peaceful way. But at the same time, he had signed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were one of the worst laws ever passed. The Alien and Sedition Acts, they basically made it illegal for someone to criticize the government in any way, shape, or form, as well as the fact that they also made it much harder for a legal immigrant to become a citizen. However, Adams, he did reluctantly sign this bill, but at the same time, his act of signing it was not good, especially in our early country, and it would not set a good precedent. And because of this, I'll put John Adams as a C tier president. So Thomas Jefferson, I'd say, is A tier. So Jefferson, I'd say, is a great president for numerous reasons. Number one, the Louisiana Purchase, which was basically he purchased lands that had stretched from present-day Louisiana all the way to parts of Idaho from France. And it was a pretty good deal, I have to say, even though there were some questions over whether or not it was constitutional. I think Jefferson made the right move. Also, the Lewis and Clark expeditions were a good idea. Jefferson also, he established the first Naval Academy at West Point. He did a great job handling the Barbary Wars, which basically you had a bunch of pirates off the coasts of several ships in Africa. They were basically kidnapping American settlers. I think Jefferson took a strong stance against this, and that was good. Jefferson also, I think he did a great job with regards to how he handled he also was a president who banned the importation of slavery from foreign countries. He signed the law which basically outlawed the international slave trade in 1807. However, Jefferson is not perfect. He signed the Embargo Act, which did cripple northern industry as well as trade, and the entire U.S. economy was pretty much ruined by Jefferson's Embargo Act. Also, this escalated conflicts with the British, and which led to the War of 1812, which his successor, James Madison, did not really do a good job of fixing. Now, you may be surprised that I'm putting James Madison in D tier. Now, there are reasons why. First of all, he didn't even really do that much as president, if you look at it. Now, Madison, I have to say, he, like John Adams, he had a great career before he was president, but when he was president, not so much. So, unlike John Adams, who de-escalated the conflict with France as much as possible. Madison did the opposite. He escalated the conflict with the British and, in fact, declared war on the British in the War of 1812. The war was a complete disaster. Ultimately, it was a complete waste of time. We had failed to even get any land in Canada, and the British had successfully burned down the White House. You could have even argued that the War of 1812 was a British victory, and Madison did not do a good job handling the War of 1812, and afterwards, after the war had ended, there isn't really that much notable to say about Madison's presidency. I guess you could say that he did a good job in sense that he was not a tyrannical leader during the war, but that really does not seem like a good defense of Madison, and ultimately, I wouldn't say he's as bad to be the F tier, but I'd say he's a D tier for me. So James Monroe was a fantastic president, in my opinion. He should be A tier material. I don't think Monroe is as good as Jefferson, but he certainly was a good president. So Monroe was actually kind of a hands-off president. He left much of the governing towards his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, and many of his cabinet members. He also tried to construct a good cabinet, which consisted of people from all regions of the United States. And James Monroe was also a very pragmatic and moderate guy. He had been willing to sign infrastructural improvements, which he had previously opposed in the 1790s as a Democratic Republican. He had also actually supported the National Bank, which was something he was strongly against before. Not to mention the fact that probably Monroe's greatest accomplishment was the Monroe Doctrine, in which he told the European countries that the New World was not theirs. Basically, it was the idea that the Americans they would not intervene in European affairs if the Europeans did not intervene in the affairs of the New World. And Monroe also, I believe it was under him where we had the Adams-Otis Treaty, in which we were able to acquire all of Florida rather than just West Florida, which was what Jefferson and Madison were aiming for. Under Monroe, I believe we had you also had better relations with the British under Monroe, and while most of this goes to the credit of his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, I believe that Monroe had a fantastic presidency overall. And speaking of John Quincy Adams, I'd also put him as a C tier. I'd say he's slightly better than his father, but not good enough to be in B tier. The reason why is because John Quincy Adams did not even have like a colorful presidency. Not much happened at all. The most exciting thing about John Quincy Adams' presidency was like infrastructure improvements and stuff like that, and which pretty much all of the previous presidents did. Not to mention the fact that John Quincy Adams, you had the tariff of 1828, the tariff of abominations, which I think was just way too high. Not to mention the fact that I think John Quincy Adams, just like his father and Madison, is another president who had like a really good career before he was president, but as president, not really much happened, and he was not a good communicator at all, and that's why he lost big to Andrew Jackson in 1828. And Andrew Jackson, I'd say, is a C tier. I'd say C to D. I'll put him as a low C tier because while Jackson, yes, his Native American policy was by no means good. He removed thousands of Native Americans from their lands and forced them out west, and thousands of them died in the Trail of Tears, which was awful. However, Jackson also, it was under his presidency that you had the entire payment of the National Bank. Andrew Jackson is the only president who has paid off the entire National Bank. And think of that today. It's remarkable today to have a president who can even lower the national debt. So I commend Jackson for doing so. And also, you had the nullification crisis had occurred under Jackson's presidency. However, at the same time, Jackson, I think he did a great job handling the nullification crisis. His leadership during the conflict was excellent. He was able to tell South Carolina that had they seceded from the Union, there would be trouble, and indeed there was. I believe Jackson did a fantastic job handling that. However, that's where the pros of Andrew Jackson end. He removed the second bank of the United States, which was good in the short term, but in the long term, it had created an economic recession, and the farmers and the people who had admired him the most were the people who were hurt most by Jackson's economic policy. Not to mention, he's the one who started the spoils system in the government, in which they basically that jobs in the government would be rewarded only towards political supporters and nobody else. I also believe that Jackson, his foreign policy wasn't even like that colorful, so I'd say he's a low C tier president overall. And his successor, Martin Van Ruin, is a D tier president. Van Buren actually, he had most of the Indian Removal Act was actually enforced under the Van Buren presidency. Also, Van Buren did not do a great job handling the Panic of 1837. The economic recession was very bad, probably the worst economic recession of the time, and Van Buren did not do a great job handling it. Also, as for foreign policy, not really that eventful. And overall, his inefficiency when it came down to dealing with the economic crisis is why I'm putting him at D tier. He was kind of like a prelude to Herbert Hoover, if you ask me. So John Tyler, I'd say he's a high C tier overall. I think Tyler is overrated as president. So he took over after William Henry Harrison had died. And the thing about Tyler is that his domestic policy, he was unable to do that much because he couldn't compromise efficiently with the Whig Congress. And even though he was a Whig himself, he was pretty much a Democrat in spirit. He had supported states' rights, limited federal government. Also, he had supported the expansion of slavery, which many Whigs had opposed. So Tyler was at odds with many of the congressional Whigs, and in fact, he got expelled from the party, and he did not do a good job compromising with them, so nothing really got done in terms of domestic policy. Yes, the economy did get slightly better under Tyler's tenure. You also had I believe, also you had foreign affairs. I think Tyler's foreign policy was a great success, particularly with regards to territorial expansion. He had pushed for the annexation of Texas. Also, he was able to succeed with regard to the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, in which basically they settled many territorial disputes with the British that were occurring at the time. And overall, I'd say Tyler was a somewhat solid president. I mean, after his presidency had ended, he had become a supporter of the Confederacy, and he actually was elected a Confederate congressman, but he died before he could serve. But that was after his presidency, so I can't judge him for that. So James Polk is solid A tier, I'd say. I'd actually may even argue that he's better than Jefferson. So the reason why I think really highly of James Polk is because of how much he was able to do within just 4 years. So Polk, you had a lot of territorial expansion under Polk's administration. He had four goals, which were to reestablish the independent treasury, to reduce tariffs, to acquire some or all of Oregon, as well as to acquire California. And Polk had succeeded in all four of these goals within just 4 years, and after that he stepped down and did not run for a second term. His management over the Mexican-American War was fantastic, and overall, the territorial expansion of the United States is the reason why I'm having him so high. Millard Fillmore, C-tier president. I mean, didn't really do all that much. I think I'll put him ahead of Jackson. So the reason why I don't really have the highest opinion of Millard Fillmore is because he signed the Fugitive Slave Act, as well as the fact that the Compromise of 1850 was really just an effort to kick the can of slavery down the road, and kick the can it did, and it actually may have inflamed sectional conflicts rather than resolved them. Millard Fillmore, while yes, he did have the foreign policy under Fillmore was good. He had the same Secretary of State as John Tyler, Daniel Webster. He had also opened up trade and relations with Japan, which was a very isolationist country up until this point. However, overall, I'd say Fillmore is kind of a C-tier president, didn't really do all that much. Franklin Pierce is going to be our first F tier. I think I'll also throw in James Buchanan there as well. Both of these presidents were exceptionally weak during the Civil War. They did not have a good management of the sectional conflicts, and by attempting to compromise, they only made the issue even worse. I'd say Buchanan is worse than Pierce because of the fact that the southern states actually seceded under him, and he did not do a good job managing this. There were also many pro-Confederates in his administration. Same thing with Pierce. And Pierce also, you had the Austin Manifesto, in which there was a failed attempt to grab Cuba from Spain, and that actually backfired, which inflamed conflict with Spain, and we were actually on the verge of a war with Spain over Cuba. Not to mention the fact that with James Buchanan, he had supported the Dred Scott decision as well as the Lecompton Constitution. Both were all around awful presidents, as opposed to Abraham Lincoln, who was a very strong leader during the American Civil War, probably one of easily the second best president after George Washington. His great leadership during the American Civil War was amazing. Also, his Gettysburg Address is one of the greatest speeches ever in American history, and his role in passing the 13th Amendment and his effort in keeping the country together makes me put Lincoln as S tier. Andrew Johnson, on the other hand, was a complete disaster as president. He could not work at all with Congress. He pretty much sabotaged Reconstruction. He did not care at all about the rights of African Americans and ultimately got impeached, which he deserved. And ultimately, I'd say Andrew Johnson being president was one of the worst things which ever happened to our country with regards to civil rights, as opposed to Grant, who is probably one of the best presidents with regards to civil rights. Now, for many years, Grant, he was viewed as this drunken sob who lucked his way to the presidency. This perception is false for numerous reasons. Number one, Grant, he was a fantastic general during the American Civil War. You can't deny that. However, let's look at his presidency. Mostly, the negative view of Grant comes from the many scandals that had occurred during his presidency, as well as the economic recession during the late 1870s. Now, Grant was not a good administrator. He had trusted the wrong people and put the wrong people in his administration. But at the same time, he did do a good job prosecuting the whiskey ring, as well as the fact that he had also been a strong president with regards to civil rights. He had stabilized the post-war economy, and he also crushed the Ku Klux Klan and had pushed for the ratification of the 14th and 15th Amendments, as well as the fact that he had created the first Civil Service Commission. So overall, I'd say Grant was a solid president. I think he's underrated overall. And I'd say the same thing for his successor, Rutherford Hayes, actually. I think Hayes is also another underrated president because many people they like to blame Hayes for the fact that the Compromise of 1877, and they think that he got into the that he his way into the presidency was fraudulent. But let's forget all that. Let's just look at what happened during his presidency. You have to understand that there was a Southern Democrat. There were Southern Democrats in charge of Congress during the Hayes administration, and if there was any attempt at civil rights by Hayes, it would have certainly been blocked. And he actually did try to promote the civil rights of African Americans, but it just failed because there was a Democratic Congress. Also, I think he did a great job handling the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 and put an end to the chaos there. Also, his civil service reform policy was fantastic, and also the fact that so overall with his civil service reform, he really got the ball rolling, and he made sure that our government was more he made sure that our government was a meritocracy rather than and reformed it from the patronage system that had been started under Jackson. So Chester Arthur, I'd say, is a C tier president. I'd say high C tier. Now Chester Arthur, his biggest accomplishments were reforming the United States Navy and strengthening it, as well as promoting the civil service and signing the Pendleton Civil Service Act. However, at the same time, you had the Chinese Exclusion Act, which he had signed, but he did actually lower it from a 20-year ban to a 10-year ban. But at the same time, Arthur signing the Chinese Exclusion Act was not at all a good thing, and because of that, I can't put him at a B tier. But I think overall, he is an underrated and president who is too much overlooked. Grover Cleveland, solid B tier president. Now, the reason why I'm not going to put Grover Cleveland as an A tier is because of his of the economic disasters that had occurred during his second term. He was not really efficient at fixing the Panic of 1893. Also, he had vetoed many subsidies that were supposed to be given towards farmers, and he vetoed Civil War pensions, which I don't think were a good idea in the long run. I get that Cleveland was obsessed with a balanced budget, and that's a good thing, especially considering the fact that we had budget surpluses under Cleveland's administration. He had significantly lowered tariffs during his presidency, as well as the fact that he had opposed free silver and inflation, which I think was a good idea. And Cleveland also, overall, he also was a man of integrity. He had been a staunch supporter of civil service reform, and he continued the process which was started under Arthur and Hayes. And in fact, I also believe that he had one of the despite being a Democrat himself, I think that he had a better record on civil rights than many Democrats at the time, as well as the fact that I think overall he did a great job handling the I think it was the Pullman strike. So overall, Cleveland is a solid president, I'd say. And then we got Benjamin Harrison. Harrison, I'd say, is D tier. I'd put him above Madison. But the problem I have with Harrison is the fact that he had pretty much squandered some surpluses we had under Cleveland into a deficit through his all the spending he was doing. In fact, the Congress under him was called $1 billion Congress, and if you look at it, $1 billion spending is really nothing today. But overall, Harrison, the problem with Harrison is the fact that he had actually, first up, he had aggressively raised tariffs to a very ridiculously high level with the McKinley tariff, which was extremely unpopular. Also, his the amount of spending that his administration was doing ultimately led to the Panic of 1893, and I'd say overall another problem with Harrison was, well, he was mostly not even God. He mostly was God. He didn't even really do that much as president, as well as the fact that, well, yes, we did annex Hawaii, and he did have a good foreign policy, I'd say, overall with regards to expansionism, as well as the fact that he was a promoter of civil rights, and you had national parks, as well as the fact that he also had the Sherman Antitrust Act under him. Actually, on second thought, I'd put Harrison actually as a low C tier. So we got Grover Cleveland again. I'm not going to rank his second term, really. So actually, if I were to do that, it would be, if I was to rank Cleveland's second term as separate from his first term, then Grover Cleveland's first term would probably be an A tier, and his second term would be a D tier, most likely. So we've next got William McKinley. I put McKinley as a B tier overall. Under McKinley, we had a very strong economy. He probably one of the strongest economies we had during this period, which was the late 1880s and the 1890s. And also, we had a lot of. He also had, yes, we had higher tariffs under McKinley, but overall, I think his tariffs actually achieved economic prosperity because they raised the amount of money we were receiving. Also, not to mention the fact that in terms of foreign policy, he was a very expansionist president. We had annexed Hawaii. Also, he was a sound leader during the Spanish-American War. He had successfully freed Cuba from Spanish rule. And overall, I'd say McKinley was a solid leader, and I'll put him at B tier. Now, Teddy Roosevelt was even better, I'd say. I'd put him at A tier overall, higher than Polk. Now, Teddy Roosevelt, you had the FDA established under him. He was a progressive president. His Square Deal, I think, was a great success. You also had the conservation of many national parks, as well as the fact that he was able to avoid labor conflicts, and he had negotiated settlements between labor and businesses, unlike previous presidents who had just cracked down on labor. Also, you had the Pure Food and Drug Act, which established the FDA. I think I already mentioned that. Also, he was a trust buster, and I think overall TR was a solid president. William Howard Taft, I'd say Taft is low B tier. You didn't really see all that much under Taft's presidency. Mostly he continued Roosevelt's policies, but he kind of toned it down a little bit, which angered Roosevelt, who challenged him for a second term, which caused this guy to get elected. Wilson was an awful president all around. I wouldn't say he's as bad as Pierce Buchanan and Johnson. However, at the same time, I'd say I'll put him at F tier, honestly. So Wilson was an all around awful president. He had, well, I'm not going to really talk about his establishment of the income tax, the Federal Reserve, because those really depend on your ideology. And also, Woodrow Wilson, he was a horrifically racist president. He had supported segregation, as well as the fact that he was a supporter of the Ku Klux Klan. He screamed the birth of a nation in the White House. Despite being a president, he did that, which promoted the Ku Klux Klan and gave rise to the second Ku Klux Klan. And overall, I'd also say that he also promoted the Espionage Act as well as the Sedition Act, which really cracked down on protesters who were protesting American involvement in World War I. And also, you had the first Red Scare under Wilson's presidency around the late 1910s. So overall, Wilson was an awful president. You could say that his establishment of his 14 points were good, yes, but the cons heavily outweigh the pros, and that's why Wilson is an F tier. Warren Harding, I'd say, is a D tier president. So Harding was, I think, kind of awful in the sense that he had, well, yes, there was a lot of corruption in his presidency. as well as the fact that you had the Teapot Dome scandal. He, like Grant, he was not a good administrator. Also, I believe so. He had heavily deregulated industries that were under the Wilson administration, and the economy had improved under Harding. You also had new technologies under him, but at the same time, you had I think all the scandals that had occurred during the Harding administration were just too much, as well as the fact that he had I believe Harding also he what was it again? Yeah, Harding, his presidency, also you had the Emergency Quota Act of 1921, which restricted immigration from non-Western European countries, as well as the fact that Harding really, he himself said that he was not fit to be president and he never should have been there, and I actually agree with him on that. So, Calvin Coolidge, Coolidge is A tier, I'd say he was a significant improvement over Harding. I think he restored dignity to the White House after the Harding administration scandals. He also presided over a very strong economy. Also, he was able to decrease regulations, decrease taxes, while we had a very strong budget surpluses, and he lowered spending significantly. Overall, I'd say he was a very solid president, very similar to Grover Cleveland, and there was no economic recession under him. Many people like to blame Coolidge for the Great Depression. That is simply not true. I don't know where the proof is of Coolidge's presidency being involved with the Great Depression. He was also a staunch supporter of civil rights. He had promoted the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, which gave citizenship to Native Americans. Yes, he had signed the Immigration Act in 1924, but he did so more reluctantly than out of racism. That was a reluctant approach by Coolidge. He was also a staunch supporter of civil rights overall, and I think Coolidge was overall a very solid president, unlike Herbert Hoover, who I'd say is worse than Van Buren. Now, Hoover's presidency was a disaster. You had the after the Wall Street crash of 1929 and the Great Depression. He did not do a good job managing the Great Depression. It's admit that he did nothing during the Great Depression. He actually did quite a lot. It's just that everything he did not work. Also, Hoover, the with regards to the bonus army, he actually cracked down on World War One veterans who were seeking a raise and a bonus, which was not at all a good move, as well as the fact that Coolidge, he also raised taxes and raised tariffs during the Great Depression, which was not at all a good idea. The Smoot-Hawley tariff was a terrible bill overall. He was a weak leader during Prohibition. He was a prohibitionist, despite the fact that the American public was now strongly against Prohibition. Overall, Hoover was an all-around awful president. And FDR, I think FDR is a high B tier. I think FDR is significantly overhyped. He gets too much credit for fixing the Great Depression. He actually may have prolonged the Great Depression with some of his New Deal programs. It was really World War II which got us out of the Great Depression. FDR, while yes, establishing Social Security, Medicare, no, that was not him. Establishing Social Security, that was a great idea, as well as many of those social programs. However, at the same time, FDR, I think he was kind of tyrannical in the sense that he put many Japanese Americans into concentration camps, which was an all around terrible thing to do. He had no evidence that Japanese Americans were plotting against the government. Also, I think FDR at the same time, he also had denied Jewish refugees from World War II. He denied Jewish refugees from Germany to enter into the United States despite the horrors of the Holocaust. And at the same time, I think he also broke the two-term president, which was I'm not a big fan of FDR for breaking the two-term precedent. And at the same time, he also, I believe FDR also, he had supported packing the Supreme Court and expanding the size of the Supreme Court just because they did not like his agenda and they struck down many of his New Deal policies. Well, overall, I will say that FDR, he was a solid leader when in dark times, particularly during World War II. I think his leadership during World War II was phenomenal, and because of that, I'm going to put him in B tier rather than C tier. I think he's a high B tier overall. So next we got Harry Truman. I think Harry Truman is similar to FDR in that sense. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I think that was a good idea overall. I think he saved more lives than he destroyed more lives by bombing those two cities in Japan. I think also his the Marshall Plan was great, which was giving economic assistance to countries in Western Europe to help them rebuild. Yes, his policy of containment towards the Soviet Union was a little bit too aggressive, and that's really what caused the Cold War. Also, his many of his he could not compromise well with congressional Republicans, particularly with regards to his Fair Deal programs, which he could not get passed. You also had tons of labor conflict under Truman, as well as tons of crime and corruption. So that's why I'm not going to put Truman any higher. He also didn't do necessarily a great job handling the Korean War, but at the same time, he had presided over the creation of NATO, and during the Korean War, he had resisted attempts to nuke China. He understood that nuclear weapons should not be used that often. And overall, I'd say his policy of containment, while yes, a little bit too aggressive, was the right thing to do with regards to preventing Stalin's tyranny from going to other countries. So Truman, I'd say, is overall a B tier. Dwight Eisenhower is a solid A. I don't think he's as good as Polk, but I'd say he's better than Jefferson. So Dwight Eisenhower, he had the under Eisenhower, he had continued Truman's policy of containment. However, he did remove the U.S. troops from Korea, and he was able to negotiate a peace settlement. Also, he had a plan for invading Cuba, which was supposed to be followed by Richard Nixon if he won the 1960 election. He did not, as well as the fact that so Dwight Eisenhower was also an incredibly moderate guy. He had mostly continued FDR's New Deal despite being a Republican. Also, he had supported the interstate highway system. He established it. And he established NASA. Overall, a solid president, also a big supporter of civil rights. JFK is also, I think, it's similar to that. I put him above Coolidge, but below Monroe. I think JFK was a solid leader. He had established Peace Corps. He supported the Civil Rights Act of 1964. He really laid down the groundwork for it, as well as the fact that his handlement of the Cuban Missile Crisis was phenomenal. He did mismanage the Bay of Pigs invasion, but I think overall his Cold War leadership was excellent. So I put JFK as A tier. I do think, though, that he is overhyped because of the fact that he was assassinated. So LBJ I'd say is also a B tier president. I put him above Hayes but below Grant. So the thing about LBJ is that his domestic policy was fantastic, but his foreign policy was awful. So LBJ's domestic policy, you had the Civil Rights Act of 1964, you had the Clean Water Act, you also had, the Clean Air Act. You also had he also had amended Social Security to include Medicare and Medicaid, as well as he had ended restrictive immigration laws such as through the Hart-Celler Act, which had allowed refugee immigrants from non-Western European countries. Also, but when it came down to foreign policy, his aggressive escalation of the Vietnam War was a bad idea. Also, he was not good at dealing with the protests at home, especially when it came down to crime issues. And overall, the riots, I do not think LBJ did a good job of handling the Vietnam War, which is why I'm putting him only at a B tier. However, I think his domestic policy successes weigh out his foreign policy failures. Richard Nixon, I'd say, is a high C tier. Watergate is really bringing him down. The Watergate scandal was an awful stain on the presidency. Also, he had actually continued the Vietnam War despite promising to end it. He had expanded the conflict to Laos and Cambodia. However, eventually, after he was seeing that the tide was turning against him, he withdrew forces from Vietnam. Also, he started the whole war on drugs, which I think was kind of a bad idea. Honestly, it made the issue even worse. He also had, but there were some pros of Nixon's presidency also. He had established the EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency, and he also, so he established the EPA. Also, you had the improved relations with China and the Soviet Union. Even though he was a staunch anti-communist, he was the first president to visit China, and we really had that policy of de-escalation with the Soviet Union in the Cold War. But at the same time, throughout his second term, early presidency, you had a lot of stagflation. So overall, I'd say Nixon is really kind of a slightly below average president. So next we got Gerald Ford. I think Ford is another C tier. I put him better than Nixon. He did restore honor and dignity to the White House, but he didn't necessarily do a fantastic job handling the recession during the 1870s. I think also However, I'd say he did do a good job, and really not that much happened under Ford's presidency. He kind of continued Nixon's policy with regards to detente with the Soviet Union, so I can't really say all that much with Ford. Carter is, I'd say, D tier. I'd put him, actually, I'd say he's better than Van Buren and Harding because of the fact that his foreign policy, while yes, he had continued much of Ford's uh, foreign policy. I think at the same time, after the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, relations deteriorated. You also had the Iran hostage crisis. You had an oil crisis. You had an economic recession with stagflation. I don't think Carter was a really strong leader, unlike Ronald Reagan, who I'll put in the B tier. I'd say he's in between Truman and Roosevelt. So the thing with Ronald Reagan is, I'd put him actually a bit lower than that, honestly. I think Reagan is another president who's kind of overhyped a little bit. So Reagan ultimately, yes. Let's talk about his negatives first. So Reagan, you had the national debt be tripled under his presidency because of his aggressive raising of of spending of defense spending. You also had, and also because of how much the aggressive tax deductions. You also had a lot. He also ignored the AIDS epidemic, as well as the fact that you had the. I think Reagan also he ignored the AIDS epidemic. I already said that, and also, because of the fact that he tripled the national debt, he also bombed Libya, which was not a good idea. And I think he was a little bit too interventionist with regards to foreign policy. There was also a lot of corruption in his administration, particularly with the Iran-Contra affair. However, he was a really strong leader during the Cold War overall, and I think his aggressive raising of spending, of defense spending, ultimately trashed the Soviet economy and he played a big role in the Soviet Union's demise. And at the same time, he had actually good relations with Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet leader, and he was a very effective speaker and communicator. And overall, Reagan is a solid president, I'd say. George H.W. Bush. This may surprise you, but I'm actually going to put George H.W. Bush in the A tier. This may be because of the fact that he recently died, I don't know, but at the same time, I think George H.W. Bush is a severely underrated president. First of all, the recession of the early 1990s, I think that was mostly because of the very high deficit that was caused by the aggressive defense spending of both him and Reagan. But he did a great job with regards to the Persian Gulf War. He knew that invading Iraq would not be a good idea, but at the same time, I'd say this was one of the last wars we had that was actually for a good cause. And Bush also, his decision to raise taxes was controversial, but overall, I think it actually did cause many of the budget surpluses that we saw under the Cleveland administration. I mean the Clinton administration, and also Bush overall. I think his policy towards I think that law he signed, the Americans with Disabilities Act, was a great idea, and he promoted the rights of Americans who had disabilities. And I think I think Bush was overall a solid and underrated president. And Bill Clinton, this is a hard one, actually. Honestly, I think this is where I should stop, honestly, maybe, because I think this is way too modern, but at the same time, like, the 1990s, that's like 30 years from now, so I think I should rank Bill Clinton. So Clinton, I'd say he's probably around a B tier. I'd put him, like, right around here. I think I'll put him around here. You had a lot of budget surpluses under Clinton's presidency. He also knew effectively how to work with congressional Republicans, and that actually made him a lot more moderate than he actually was, or more conservative than he actually was. And at the same time, though, Clinton's foreign policy was not the best. He had failed to capture he failed to capture Osama bin Laden, as well as the fact that his I think under the Clinton administration, though, the economy was especially strong. I don't know how much of that had to do with him, though. But at the same time, I think Bill Clinton's economic policies were a great idea. He was vastly popular, one of the most popular presidents we've had. He was also a good communicator, I'd say. And I think overall, Clinton, I'd say, is a B-tier president. As for George W. Bush, Bush really ruined everything that happened under Clinton. I put him at D tier overall. The thing about Bush is that with his by getting involved in the Middle East, especially his his response to 9/11, I don't think that was a good idea. I think No Child Left Behind was a terrible law when it came down to education reform. Also, the Hurricane Katrina he did not do a good job handling that, as well as the recession of the late 2000s. And if you just look at pure statistics, I don't think Bush was a good president. The budget surpluses that had occurred under Clinton's administration were all squandered because of Bush's spending on foreign policy as well as his aggressive tax cuts, which really is the reason why our deficit is so massive today. So there we go. That's all. These are all the presidents that I've tier ranked. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you are new, and bye.